Right. Hello, Year 11. So I'm just here to give you a quick video guide on how to do question 2 on the USA 1920 to 1973 paper. Okay. Now remember, on the USA paper, you are given 3 questions on interpretations and you have 3 other questions. So there's 6 questions in total, but the first 3 will be about a pair of interpretations that you're given with your exam. Okay. Now question 2 is only worth 4 marks and you should really be spending maximum of 6 minutes on it, okay? Remember, with the America paper, if you times the marks by 1.5, that's roughly how long you should spend on it, okay? So the 4 marker, you spend roughly 6 minutes, the 8 marker, 12 minutes, and so on and so forth. Okay, so question 2, what does it look like? Okay, so these are the kind of, the structure of question 2 is always exactly identical, okay? So it's always, why might the authors of interpretations A and B have a different interpretation about something, okay? So both interpretations will be about a specific issue and you have to be able to explain why their interpretation of that thing is different. So in the case of this one here, you've got about why their interpretations about the impact of the movies in the 1920s different. This one is about women in the 1920s. This one about why Roosevelt won the 1932 election. And this one about the impact of the feminist movement, okay? So it's really important when you get question 2 to actually underline the tail of the question and say, right, I'm looking for why they have a different opinion on what specific issue, okay? So in this case, why Roosevelt won the 1932 election. So always make sure to underline that so you know what you're really clearly meant to be focusing on. Now, a good answer to this question, okay, a couple of things you want to make sure you're doing. You want to make sure that you're focusing on the provenance of the interpretation and thinking about how that has affected the interpretation that's being given, okay? So, this person thinks this about the impact of changes that were brought about by the New Deal. Okay, let's look at who they are, why they wrote this interpretation, when they wrote it, and why might that mean they have a different take from the author of this other interpretation. So it's all about thinking about the backgrounds of the authors and thinking about how that might mean they have a slightly different take on the particular historical event the question's focusing on. You want to make sure that you've got 2 developed points, okay? And by 2 developed points, I mean that you can actually get full marks on this question with 4 very good sentences, okay? You might need to write a little bit more than that, 5 or 6, but I could certainly get full marks on this with 4 well-constructed sentences. So you don't have to write loads. You have to have 2 points which you develop each time. Now, linked to that, timing with this question is really, really important. Concision, being able to write your ideas succinctly in a short space, is quite important, okay? The reason for that is obviously this question is not worth that many marks, but it's also fairly straightforward. So you want to get to the point where you can write it in 5 or 6 minutes. And to do that, you're going to have to make sure that you're very concisely able to hit all 4 marks out of 4, okay? Another common mistake to avoid in this question, besides spending too long on it, okay, is not to describe how the interpretations are different from each other, but to focus upon why they're different from each other. Remember, question 1 is asking you, how are they different? So you'll be given the interpretations and you have to say, well, this person is saying this about this event, whereas this person is saying this. For this question on question 2, you're not describing how they're different from each other. You're trying to explain why, okay? So in question 1, you're trying to say, okay, so these are how these 2 interpretations are different in terms of how they see the impact of the New Deal. In question 2, you're trying to think, okay, given what we're finding out in the little box description about this author, why is it that their interpretation is different from this other person, yeah? So question 1 is about how the interpretations are different. It's almost just like a comprehension question, really, right? Reading them both and seeing what the differences are. The second question is getting you to go a bit deeper and think about, okay, so why might they be different from each other in terms of their interpretation of whatever event the question's getting you to focus on. Another common mistake to avoid, besides timing and making sure that you don't write about how, but why they're different, is to also make sure that you don't just describe who the author is without explaining how this has affected the interpretation's point of view. Now, what I mean by that is on this question, sometimes students will just repeat a little bit from the description of the author and just take that as an explanation. So, for example, you might have an interpretation where it says in the description, this person was a member of the American Communist Party. And then a student might just write as their explanation, this person was a member of the American Communist Party, so their interpretation is different. Okay, but you have to explain how. Okay, why would that change their interpretation? Yeah, so it's not enough just to describe who the author is and just parrot back things from the description of the interpretation. You have to be able to then explain, okay, but why would that lead them to have a different interpretation from the other person? You'll see an example of what I mean by that in just a minute. Okay, so I'm going to show you just a model answer quickly before I then show you another one, which I'm going to get you guys to try and complete at home. Now, some of you might have seen this question before. So you get two interpretations here. And remember, on the exam paper, you will have 3 questions that are all about the pair of interpretations you're given. Okay. Now, in the case of this one, you've got first question, how does interpretation B differ from interpretation A about women in the 1920s? So that's your question about how they're different from each other. That's when you're focusing on the actual content. Okay. Question 2, which we're doing now, why might the author's interpretations A and B have a different interpretation about women in the 1920s? So in this one, we're focusing a little bit more on the backgrounds of the authors. So that's always given in italics as a little description about the person who wrote it, when and why. Okay, so we're thinking about, okay, given that their backgrounds are this, why does that mean their interpretation is slightly different? Now, question 3 is in a separate video. In that one, you have to kind of use your knowledge to say which interpretation you find more convincing. Okay, so in question 3, it's more about using your own background knowledge to assess the claims in each interpretation, but we won't focus on that for now. Okay, so let's zoom in on question 2 then. Okay, so it's probably worthwhile just to quickly read through these 2 interpretations just to make sure you understand where the answer's sort of coming from. Okay, now it mentions here that you can also use some of your contextual knowledge to analyse the interpretation's provenance. You don't need to go into detail on that, but just sometimes if you've got good background knowledge, that might help you write a better analysis of why the interpretations are different. I'll show you an example of what I mean by that in a minute. So before I show you a model answer in this question, let's just have a quick look at the interpretations and then we'll look at how we could answer it. Right, so interpretation A, okay, and this is the stuff we're going to think really hard about for question 2, is the background of the author. Okay, so in the case of interpretation E, right, it's from a book written by Doris Fleischmann, published in 1932. Doris was writing about what life was like for women in the 1920s. She was a famous campaigner for the rights of women. Okay, so that's what we found out about Fleischmann and when she wrote this and who she was. Right, so she says, it was totally confusing to read the adverts in the magazines that showed vacuum cleaners, fridges and hundreds of other household devices which should lighten the jobs of women in the home. Women living on farms did a great deal of work besides caring for their children, washing clothes and cooking, as they worked in the fields and looked after the animals. The largest group of American women were the families of labourers, miners, steel workers and unskilled workers. The wages of the men were generally so small that the women had to do extra work. Now, in terms of so what's that interpretation really saying about women in the 1920s? So it's really kind of like saying, well, okay, all this idea that they had all these consumer items and that women had much more opportunities were a bit exaggerated, right? That most women are still either living on farms, they're having to work quite a lot, and also that the wages they get are a lot less than men. So it's probably quite a negative, or at least a quite sceptical take on the idea that the 1920s was an era where there was a lot of progress for women. Now, interpretation B, by contrast, okay, I'm actually just going to zoom out just because the thing's currently being blocked the way it is. So interpretation B, by contrast, is from an article about flappers by F. Scott Fitzgerald, published in the 1930s. So what do we find out about Fitzgerald? F. Scott Fitzgerald was an American novelist who, both in his personal life and his book, showed what it was like to be a rich playboy during the boom of the 1920s. He and his wife Zelda, who he called the first American flapper, became symbols of the jazz age. Now, before I even read the content of this extract, I can probably guess he's going to probably have a slightly more positive take on the opportunities for women in the 1920s because his wife was a flapper, one of these women who was able to take advantage of the new lifestyles of the 1920s. So let's see what he has to say. Right, it was an age of miracles and an age of overindulgence. There was a generation of women who saw themselves as flappers. The wildest of all generations decided to take as much pleasure as they could. Eat, drink, and merry, for tomorrow we die was their motto. Although their grandmothers didn't know it, these young women had discovered alcohol and jazz. So again, a slightly more positive take in lots of ways. It's talking about the kind of new liberating opportunities available to women in the 20s, okay, so they can go out behind their grandmother's back and listen to jazz and drink alcohol, that they kind of have these slightly wild, decadent lifestyles, okay? So it's a slightly more glamorous take on the role that women played in the 1920s. So what we have to think about is, okay, so this one is a largely kind of negative or skeptical take on the position of women in the 1920s. And this one is a slightly more positive one. Now, for question 2, what we're really trying to think about, though, is, okay, so why might these authors have this different take? Why is it that interpretation A says that actually life was quite challenging for women in the 1920s, whereas this one has a slightly more glamorous idea that there were lots of opportunities and new freedoms for women, okay? And this is where we had to read about their backgrounds and think, okay, so how has that affected, why does Fleischmann have this take and why does Fitzgerald have this take? Now, this is kind of what I mean by 2 developed points, okay? So I'm going to first of all try and focus on, okay, so what does one interpretation say and why? So I say, right, interpretation A has a more negative view about the position in the 1920s because it is by a campaigner for women's rights. Now, like I said before, when we were looking at these common things to avoid, you don't just stop there, though. You don't just say, oh, well, she was a campaigner for women's rights, so it's more negative, okay? You have to explain, okay, so she's a campaigner for women's rights, so what? Yeah? How does that mean that she has a different interpretation to Fitzgerald? So, interpretation A has a more negative view about the position of women in the 1920s because it is by a campaigner for women's rights. As a campaigner for women's rights, it is likely that Doris Fleischmann would have been aware of the struggles many women faced in the 1920s in order to fight for improvements to women's conditions. So again, I've explained why that would lead her to have a different interpretation to Fitzgerald. What you then want to do is you want to compare the background of the other interpretation to the one you've talked about. I think a really good sentence starter to use is to use the phrase by contrast. Okay, so you're comparing, yeah? So you can either start it by saying in comparison interpretation B, or you could say interpretation B by contrast, okay? So either by contrast or in comparison to, yeah? So you're just making it clear with your point sentence that you are comparing the interpretations. So interpretation B by contrast has a more positive view about the position of women at the time because it is by a wealthy author whose wife Zelda was a famous flapper. And again, just like before, I'm not stopping there. I'm not just like expecting the person reading it to go like it's self-explanatory that, oh, well, she's a flapper, so obviously she'd have this take. I need to fully explain it. Okay, so his wife's a flapper. He's from an upper class background. So what? Why does that change his interpretation compared to Fleischmann? Right. Coming from this background, it's likely Fitzgerald would have mainly associated with higher class urban women, like his wife, who were best placed to take advantage of the new opportunities open to women in the 1920s. He would have had less contact with the working class and rural women Fleischmann is describing. So again, I've then explained, okay, so why does he have this positive take based upon his background? Well, because he's going to be mostly associating with the kind of women who were able to take advantage of the opportunities available to some women in the 1920s, okay? So I both described who they both are, but then explain why that would lead them to have a different interpretation. That would certainly be full marks, okay? And when I mentioned before that you can sometimes bring in your knowledge of context to enrich your analysis, that last sentence there would just be kind of an example of that, right? That I'm just sort of mentioning here, that it kind of shows that I've got knowledge of the context that I say that, you know, he associated with high-class urban women who could take advantage of the new opportunities of the 1920s. I'm using my background knowledge that I know that actually the flappers were mostly in the big cities and were mostly upper-class women. Women who lived in rural areas or women from poorer backgrounds weren't able to take advantage so much. Yeah. So if you're bringing in knowledge of context, that's the only way you're doing it. You're just using it to make your analysis a little bit more sophisticated. Okay. So remember, like I said before, you want to make sure that it's concise and that you are both explaining as well as describing the backgrounds of the authors. Now, I'm just going to show you one other example of a model answer. And with this one, I want to see, you might want to pause the video at the end and see if you can finish it. Okay. So this one is about two authors who have different takes on the New Deal. Now, I'm not going to read through the whole thing this time, but again, the same structure for this question. So why might the author's interpretation A and B have a different interpretation about President Roosevelt's New Deal? Okay. Now, if we look at the descriptions of each interpretation, just to sort of speed things up on this one, in interpretation A, this author has quite a negative take on the New Deal. He doesn't really see it as offering more freedom to the American people, and and he's on a demonstration opposing Roosevelt's inauguration. So he's someone who's quite skeptical of the New Deal in some ways. This one here is much more positive and sort of says that the New Deal saved America from unemployment and kind of political extremism. So it's a much more positive take. Now, for this question, though, we're zooming in on focusing on, well, okay, so why do they have these interpretations? Why is this one more negative and this one more positive when it came to the New Deal? Now, in the first one, what do we learn about the author? Right, John Gates, in his book, The Story of an American Communist, published in 1959, in the early 1930s, Gates was a student. He had discovered the writings of Karl Marx in which he had said that he found the answers to the causes of depression, socialism, and a world brotherhood of man. Soon afterwards, he joined the Young Communist League. So this guy was someone who was an American communist, right? He was very, very left-wing. It's quite likely that he probably saw Roosevelt as a bit too moderate, because Roosevelt wasn't left-wing enough for lots of American radicals at that time. So that's probably going to explain why he had a slightly more skeptical take on the New Deal because of his communist beliefs. Right. By contrast, then, Richard Tugwell, in his book The Democratic Roosevelt, published in 1957, Tugwell was a member of the Democratic Party and a close friend of Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1932, he joined a team to advise Roosevelt during the presidential election. Roosevelt consulted Tugwell about the banking crisis and the New Deal. So that's what we learn about his background, and it's not necessarily that surprising then that he's positive about the New Deal, right? He was someone who was a member of the same political party as Roosevelt, unlike Gates, right? He's a member of the Democrats. Also, he joined a team to try and advise Roosevelt during the election. So he's clearly someone who's quite sympathetic to Roosevelt and what he's trying to do. Now, if I'm then going to be doing a analysis then, right, I'll do the first one for you. And then what I would recommend you guys do is pause the video and see if you can copy out and finish off the answer. So I might say for this one, remember, because we want to describe and then explain why interpretation A has the take it does. So we could say, right, interpretation A has a more negative view about the New Deal because it is by an American communist. So again, I'm describing the background of the author, but I'm then going to explain, well, why does that mean he has the particular take that he does? So interpretation A has a more negative view about the New Deal because it is by an American communist. As a communist, John Gates would have likely been one of the radicals who criticised the New Deal for not going far enough. This is the position of politicians like Huey Long. Again, showed off a bit of knowledge of the context there. Now, what I would recommend doing now, guys, if you pause here, see if you can finish this one. So can you now explain, well, why would Rexford Tugwell have a different interpretation based upon who he is and his background? So you can start off with interpretation B, by contrast, has a more positive view about the... Oh, sorry, that should say, has a more positive view about the New Deal. Because it is by, and then you want to describe who wrote the interpretation, and then you want to try and make sure that you can explain, okay, so why does that mean that he's got the more positive interpretation that he does? Okay, so that's it really, guys. You don't need to do any more than that. It is, like I said, it's not a very hard question to get full marks on, as long as you know to focus on the right things, okay? So just to remind us of some of the key points then, just before we finish up. And again, you can come back and pause it on this and finish this question off later. So remember, you're focusing on the provenance of the interpretation in this question. So you're focusing on those bits in italics describing who the authors are, and you're trying to use that to explain why they have different interpretations. You're having 2 developed points, ideally 4 sentences, maximum 5 or 6. Make sure to time it so you're not spending more than 5 or 6 minutes on it. Don't describe how the interpretations are different. Focus on why they're different from each other. And finally, make sure not just to describe who the authors are, but actually explain, okay, so given that this is who they are, why does it mean that they have this interpretation? And why does it mean it's different to the other person's? Okay. If you look in the description for the video, guys, I've also uploaded a bunch of practice questions, okay, and also places where you can find the contextual knowledge if you want to remind yourself a little bit more about that topic, okay? So that, again, is in the video description, and for this YouTube video, it should be in there as a Google Drive file, okay? So I hope that was useful, and yep, I will see you soon.